Hi everyone, my name is Nikki Crenshaw. I'm an associate principal researcher at Blizzard Entertainment on the Games User Research team, and I'm here to talk to you about the Carcinization of Azeroth, or our accessibility option for Arachnophobia that released in the War Within. I want to give a quick heads up before we get started. This is a feature about spiders and censoring spider-like creatures, so there are going to be some images of spiders and Nerubians and Faldori and other spider-adjacent models in World of Warcraft. So just as a heads up, if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, that will be coming ahead. I do want to start at the beginning here with a little bit of context about why we were looking at arachnophobia accessibility in World of Warcraft. We do have an accessibility inbox that players can write into with feedback about accessibility in all of our games. And dating back as far as 2020, we started to get emails from players asking about accessibility and citing other games that they had played as being an inspiration for them wanting to reach out and understand if arachnophobia accessibility is something to explore in World of Warcraft. And you can see in these emails here, it's people writing about their own experiences. It's people writing about friends that they brought into the game. It's people writing about partners that they want to play World of Warcraft with. And so this is something that had been on our radar for a while as something that players were interested in, but it wasn't necessarily something that was a main point of the game. So we were like, let's try to figure out how to do this effectively when it makes sense in World of Warcraft. Cue the War Within, where one of our four zones is Azkahet, which is a zone that is inhabited by Nerubians, which are spider-like creatures. This was going to be a main part of the War Within story campaign. We knew that players were going to be spending a lot of time here, and our first raid was actually set in Azkahet, where players were going to be fighting a lot of spider and Nerubian-like creatures. In addition to that, World of Warcraft has been around for quite a while, and we've really upped the fidelity of our art. Our art team is amazing, and so we've gone from spiders that look like this, which were still, freaking some people out at the time, to spiders that look like this in the War Within, which is really just amping up the amount of spideriness for our players. And so when we started to look at all of this together, we were like, is this going to be a problem for players with arachnophobia? And the short answer is yes. So we wanted to look into this and start to kind of figure out what we could do to accommodate these players and how we can do that most effectively. So we partnered with our art team to kind of look into this a little bit more and understand a bit about accessibility. We wanted to evaluate some treatments that the team had already been looking at to address arachnophobia. One of the things that the team really focused in on was addressing the way that spider legs are presented. So that was a lot of what we're testing, and I'll show you some images of that later. To do this, we ran a survey, and part of the survey was using the spider distress scale from Peters et al. In 2022 to measure just how arachnophobic they were. And we'll look at that as well. We got some sentiment around arachnophobia in general. We looked at WoW's proposal and got the reactions to that. And then we assessed the different model treatments that we had and saw what players' reactions were to those. We focused this on Activision Blizzard King employees who self-identified as being at least mildly arachnophobic and then measured that quantitatively with the survey. And they didn't necessarily have to have prior experience with WoW because we just wanted to understand the visuals of the model, not necessarily the models in gameplay. So the first thing we'll be talking about here is understanding what contributes to arachnophobia. We wanted to figure out, we focused on legs. Is that really going to address the problem, or are there other things that are contributing to those fear and disgust responses that players with arachnophobia have? We also looked at our current model treatments to determine, hey, what's going on with the base models? How are the model treatments doing? And then the original proposal for this feature was actually pretty different from what ended up shipping. And so we were able to get some feedback to the team on what was going on there and how that was going to be received. And then finally, now that this feature is out, we'll take a look at kind of what happened, how the scope changed, and what players have been saying since the feature came out. So first I want to talk about the spider distress scale. This is a scale that has been validated by academic researchers that measures fear and disgust in relation to spiders, and it measures that on a 7-point scale from completely disagree to completely agree. So for these two categories, first we have fear. That includes statements like looking at pictures of spiders makes me feel uncomfortable, while disgust has statements like I feel sick when I imagine eating a sandwich that a harmless spider had walked over. And we calculated these scores and looked at how players fell in terms of both their fear and disgust separately to understand what kind of players we were looking at in terms of the feedback that we were getting. So for our fear category, 55% of our respondents fell into the extreme fear bucket. The way that we categorized these players, there was low, moderate, high, and extreme. You can see that we had no low fear players in this group. And this was by percentile. So low was below the 33rd percentile, moderate was between 34 and 66, high was 67 to 89, and extreme was 90th percentile and higher. So having a lot of those players in extreme definitely bodes well for us getting legitimate feedback on this work. We see similar things with disgust, with 45% of players having extreme disgust and another 40 having high disgust. Same percentiles again. And so we're seeing from this audience that over 80% of our participants are scoring high or extreme in both fear and disgust of spiders. So when we're looking at this data, we can assume that this is a good and representative sample of what our arachnophobic players out in the world might be feeling if they saw these same models. Next step is understanding more about arachnophobia in general. And so we started by asking a lot of our players how they play World of Warcraft today because there are already spiders in Azeroth, as we mentioned before. And we had players mention a lot of different strategies that they use for engaging with spiders or more often avoiding spiders. And that included things like avoiding areas where they know that spiders might be. And that included things like major cities or areas where people might have spider pets. So, they're missing out on that social experience, getting help from their friends or partners to kill spiders, looking away or looking at other areas of the screen while they're playing so they don't have to engage with the spider, trying to kill spiders quickly, popping all your cooldowns just to get this fight over with, adjusting their camera orientation during combat, so doing things like zooming into first person and looking at the ground so you don't necessarily have to see the spider. But some of our players said that compared to other games, WoW was less problematic for them when it came to spiders because the character models weren't as realistic. And so this player says WoW spiders traditionally have been pretty okay. Perhaps it's the color choices. Black widows are the only ones that really creep me out. Another player who says the spiders in WoW aren't realistic enough to make me completely avoid them, but I'll sometimes not be able to stay in that area for too long. So it was interesting to see a range of responses and how players kind of engage with this stuff today and making sure that we're addressing this effectively for them, right? For this range of players we have. We also asked them about a bunch of different aspects of spiders that could create feelings of discomfort. And we wanted to understand how severe those feelings were based on the different features. And so the chart we have here has every item we asked all kind of stacked together. And we see that a lot of these are quite high, right? We have a 5-point scale from not at all uncomfortable to extremely uncomfortable. And quite a few of those are at very uncomfortable, which is 4 or higher. We had an option for players to write other aspects that made them uncomfortable as well, and that included things like features of the legs, so having long or spindly legs, seeing the hydraulic motions of the legs moving, the environment or atmosphere that indicates spiders might be coming, so seeing a lot of webs being something that we asked about, but cave areas and things like that. The bodies of the spiders themselves, the kind of bulbous back end of the spider, and swarming behavior, so having a lot of spiders coming at you very rapidly all at once. So you can see on this chart, we have quite a few different things. We deal with things like eyes and fangs, we deal with legs, we deal with sizes, we deal with spider adjacent elements like webs and cocoons and sounds. We talk about movement, we talk about color and texture, and we talk about grouping behaviors. And so like I mentioned before, the main thing that we were focused on was this idea of legs and having accurate numbers of legs or accurate representations of legs. And while that's high, there's definitely other things that are higher than it and things that are just as high as this element as well. So what we learned here was that just looking at legs was not going to solve our players' arachnophobia concerns. We were only addressing one attribute that contributes to spider fear, which is legs. And so we saw that a lot of other things contributed to that feeling of discomfort, including things like realistic textures or fast movement speeds or jumping movements or the size of the spider itself. So our original proposals wouldn't have necessarily served players' needs because there were other things that were still triggering a spider response from them. This picture here is actually a spider with less legs. There are only 6 legs on this model. And players were like, nope, it still looks like a spider. There are still so many aspects of this that read as spider to me. And so this was something that we needed to look back at and figure out, okay, how do we continue and move this forward? So if it's more than just legs, what kind of things should we look at addressing? Realistic textures were the biggest thing that triggered discomfort response in players. And when you look at some other games that handle arachnophobia, you see that this is one of the main things that they address. So we have some examples here from Grounded, Hogwarts Legacy, Lethal Company, and Satisfactory. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but you can see here that that realistic texture component is missing from all of these. Other areas that we found to be particularly important include things like movements, so especially anything that's fast movement speed, jumping movement animations, or walking movement animations where they can really see the legs articulating, being something that was triggering an arachnophobic response in players. The realistic color and texture, like we mentioned, so things that resemble real world spiders and give players that kind of fear that they experience in the real world in the virtual setting. Larger sizes, especially for any sizes that are similar to a player character or larger. In our survey, next to the size specifically, we gave a point of reference in relation to a character. So, like, much smaller than a character, about the same size as a character, much larger than a character. Those bigger ones were definitely the ones that caused more of a discomfort response. Spawning behaviors for particularly spiders in large groups. So, regardless of size, if it's a bunch of teeny spiders, that's also very scary and fear inducing. The presence of sound, so things like chittering or the tapping of the legs as they walk, was also something that players mentioned. The visibility of the eyes and seeing a lot of the eyes. And then the visibility of the fangs and mandible, so a lot related to the base of the spider and details there. So this was kind of a good way to look at holistically if we are trying to address arachnophobia in a game. These are sort of the elements that I think are most effective that we should be looking at as an industry for addressing this and making sure that our players feel comfortable. There were a few other things that we learned through this that I think were pretty cool. We had a bunch of different model kind of categories that we presented to players. And one of the things that we asked them is like, here's a model. In your opinion, should this be included in the arachnophobia mode? And they could say, don't include this or definitely include this. And so one of the first things we saw was that the more humanoid a model was, the more acceptable it was for players to be included, especially when we compared that to bestial counterparts. So here we have an example of 3 Faldori models, and on average, players said, probably don't need to include this in the arachnophobia mode. We're averaging at a negative 0.7 on a -2 to +2 scale. So this was interesting to see, and especially when you compare that to the corrupted Faldori, which are much more bestial, this swings a full point in the other direction, and now we're at probably include, right? So this was really interesting to see. We tested this statistically as well. There was a statistically significant difference here, and we saw players talk about this in their open-ended responses as well. This player says humanoid spiders were significantly less bothersome to me, though it still feels like we ought to include them if we can. I think for most people, realistic spiders are priority though. I found that the more humanoid features a creature had, the less uncomfortable I felt. Those with 4 legs or those that were missing the bulbous rear were fairly alright for me. Perhaps those could be overlooked. Another aspect here was that the more fantasy forward the character got, the more okay players were with it, and the more grounded in reality it felt, the more uncomfortable they were. And so we see this again where we have the crystalline Nerubian, which are very, not colors that you see on spiders in the real world, and this still reads as a spider, so the average here is probably includes 0.7. But when you compare that to these models that look like they could be real world spiders, we have the Black Widow coloring, we have the more brown and earthy tones. These are all the way at definitely include. Again, like almost a full point higher than what the more fantasy forward counterparts look like that are on the same rig, that are on like have the same model shape and things like that. But just those textures alone are making it kind of shift into this, please get this away from me territory. This was another one that was statistically significant when we ran it, and we saw again players talk about these realistic textures in their open-ended responses. I definitely reacted more to multiple legs and naturalistic colors. Those two seem to be the largest lines for models that cross into the definitely yes territory for me. For me, it's mostly the movement and the legs and the realistic textures. If it's fantasy enough, it breaks away from being triggering, especially with things like the bright purple, semi-upright character with void orange eyes. So let's look a little bit at what WoW was trying to do here. We wanted to make sure that players with arachnophobia felt like they could play the game safely and comfortably, but we were exploring kind of a couple different ways to do that. And so when we had these players, we gave them this kind of pitch for, hey, the team is trying to look at giving an arachnophobia option. Originally, the plan was to provide a toy that you earned through the questing campaign, and that can be used to provide some kind of modification that we were still trying to figure out through the survey to any spiders in the outdoor zones in the War Within. And so when we gave players this information, we asked how excited they were, and you can see very excited, on average, super high in terms of how interested they were in this feature. And when we asked them to explain why, a lot of our players said that they felt like this was high value, especially for them. This player says being able to transform spiders would completely change my experience with WoW and greatly improve it. I have a lot of anxiety around encountering unexpected spiders, especially player mounts and pets in major cities. I also want to be able to go back and do nostalgic content like Naxxramas for pet mount, transmog runs, or trading post, and it would be great to experience that content without having to hide my eyes or follow my husband's character. Another player who says, I've been waiting my whole WoW life that this day would happen, and I'm grateful to finally be heard. So very emotionally impactful for these players, right? Some of our players, though, already started to express concerns about how successful the option would be and would it be able to address their needs effectively. This player says, I'm excited that we're looking at options to combat this. My only reason for choosing very excited instead of extremely excited is I've seen both good and bad arachnophobia options implemented in games, and I'm hopeful that Blizzard can find a good solution to this problem. So we're already starting to get a little bit of that wariness. And so we wanted to break down the proposal into the specific pieces of it to understand, is this going to affect the usefulness of this option for the players who need it? So we broke down each of the portions of that pitch there of it's controlled by a toy, it's a quest reward, it only affects spiders in the war within, it only affects spiders in outdoor content, and it needs to be reused when you go outside again to make sure that the filter is still applied. And so the scale here we have is, how does this affect the usefulness of this toy for you? And you can see that quite a few of these are falling on the less useful side. So in general, we were feeling like these players are seeing that this is not necessarily going to contribute to the needs that they have. And we need to think about this stuff if we want to make sure that this option is a good option for players like the player who earlier mentioned with like, is this going to be a successful implementation of this? So we talked with the team about this and putting these limitations on accessibility options and how that's actually hindering this option for the players who need to use it. The more restrictions we had, the less useful it was for our players. We saw that these players already had strategies for avoiding spiders. And so having a toy that's going to be like, well, this will help in these situations, but not in these situations, it means that they can't let their guard down and play successfully. And that was really what our goal for this toy was. So we had players said, make it a setting in the game. Don't make it a toy. Don't gamify phobias. I don't know how I feel about the decision of making this a toy as a quest reward. Isn't this a way to help people with arachnophobia? Why does a tool have to be earned? It feels belittling. I'd rather the option to apply to all spiders regardless of where the content is located. Any option to help would be great, but if the intent is to be more inclusive with this mode, I find the requirement to complete a quest to obtain the toy or the fact the toy has to be constantly reused to be gatekeeping the option. My one concern, will this apply to dungeons and raids too, or is it only the outdoor world? And at the time, it was only the outdoor world. And like these players are talking about, it's only in the new expansion, it's only in the outdoor world. And so they were seeing that, this wasn't going to be useful for them necessarily. While they were really excited about this feature, it was only going to have situational value. So we told the team, we need to investigate how to offer this option more broadly in games so that it is more useful for the players who are looking to use it. The next piece of this was looking at the different model treatments. And so this first chart that I'm going to show here, we measured again using the same verbiage as the spider distress scale, fear and disgust as ratings. And so we have the different shapes on this chart are related to the different variants, and I'll show you images of all of those in a second. And then the colors are related to the different model types because we had a few different spider related models and we wanted to understand which ones were kind of most affecting our players. And so what we would hope to see here is that some treatments would just score higher than others, right? The unmodified is the circle, so anytime you see a circle, that's just the base model. And so we would hope to see some of those treatments scoring lower than the base in terms of the fear and disgust score that players were reporting. So when we looked at this, what we actually saw was that models just kind of clustered together. So you can see the purple items here are all our base spider, our big spooky War Within spider model that just came out, and those were the highest scoring in terms of fear and disgust. Behind that, we have our Crypt Fiend model in the middle ranges there. The light teal is our Nerubian Flyer, which isn't quite a spider, but has spider-like elements in terms of the legs and the way that it moves. And that was below average in general. The green here is our Nerubian Priest. Again, this is one of those more humanoid models, and so that one was lower for players in terms of fear and disgust. And then our baby spiderling, which we were like, it's so cute. How could you be afraid of it? But so, still there in like the two ranges for fear and disgust. And then yellow is another Nerubian spiderling model that exists, and that one again a little bit lower. What you might not notice here is that all the way at the bottom here, we have the model replacement, which was the crab. And that scored at a 1 on fear and a 1.1 on disgust across our 20 players. So basically everybody selected, I am not at all fearful, I am not at all disgusted here. And that was our first kind of indicator of like, wow, this is the thing that really is succeeding, especially in comparison to some of these other variants across all of our models, right? So here's those different model variants like I was talking about. We've got the unmodified model on the left, the model with less legs, a model with smoothed out joints so that it doesn't have that traditional spider movement that players might expect, a model with less legs and the smooth joints, a model with detached legs, and then our model replacement on the end. And so we had, in general with the unmodified model, we confirmed that this was not comfortable for players. They said, this looks like a spider. I definitely don't want to be seeing this when I'm playing World of Warcraft. The model with less legs still read as a spider and didn't necessarily affect other relevant spider features that players were worried about. So, while 4 legs is definitely better than 6 legs, it still has the fang placement. It still has the eyes. And we see this player here talking about that in the quote of, 4 makes it better, but I think the eyes and fang placement still give me goosebumps. The smooth joints didn't affect the model in a meaningful way. So while this was something we were experimenting with, players were like, this still reads like a spider. It doesn't necessarily matter that the movement is different. It's still got 8 legs. It still looks like a spider. Less legs and the smooth joints were still not affecting the relevant spider features, and it made the legs feel more prominent because of the way that they moved with the smooth joints. The model with detached parts was actually more scary or as scary as the default for some of our players. This player says this wasn't effective at all. My fear comes from the amount of legs and their movement. Even detached, my brain could still fill in the gap. So this was one we experimented with, but wasn't a success for players. They still very much felt that this was a spider. And then when we saw the crab, this was all of the comments related to this model talked about how successful this solution was and how good this was as an option to make the players feel like they weren't spiders. And I know some of the feedback we've seen is, well, aren't crabs just water spiders? Based on our data, no. They don't trigger the same fear responses, the same disgust responses from players that they see with spiders and the other spider-like models. It was so much lower than basically any other model we had, any other treatment we had. And so we saw this was really the successful one. In terms of other considerations that players had for how to remove spiderness of these models, texture override, so like flat shaders over the models, or taking out other spider elements like the eyes and fangs were other solutions that players would have expected to see in addition to the legs. So when our designer started working on this and figuring out, all right, we need to figure out how to make crab successful in a world where World of Warcraft has a ton of different spider models, right? And these all have very unique feelings and they're, specific to their environment, and we want to maintain that immersive experience. So how do you do that effectively? Well, good news, World of Warcraft also has a lot of crabs, and so she found really great ways to kind of replace these models in a way that still felt true to the environment that the character came from. And so you can see here we've got a mix of little hermit crabs, traditional crabs, mechanical crabs, the makura, which are like a lobster race. We have some dragonflies for the flyers. And so we still maintain that level of diversity and feeling like the world is very like vast and broad, and this makes sense. It's not just a blue crab everywhere. And so some examples that I really love is this ghostly spider that turns into a ghostly crab, right? And these are all existing models that we had. We also had our team, when we were looking at things like a lot of the Nerubians in Ashkahet hang from webs and things like that. So the Makura at the time were kind of just swimming, and our animators actually spent time rigging up some new animations to make it so that it still felt the same in this world, and the lobster creature, is coming down from the ceiling in the same way. So really dedicated to making sure that this felt good for our players and felt like a top quality feature. And the best part was that a lot of this was already kind of baked into the game already. So, what has happened since this came out, right? We did this research, we talked with the team, and a lot of the original scope changed. So, I just kind of want to go through what happened after this work. So, originally the team was talking about enabling this via a toy that players could earn through questing. And after the research, this turned into an accessibility option in our settings menu. So, players can turn it on immediately. They don't need to get to the War Within to earn it. They can boot up the game and immediately access that feature. Originally, it was only going to affect the War Within. After the research, this now applies to all of our expansions from base World of Warcraft all the way up through the War Within. Originally, we were only going to be having these models be affected in the outdoor zones in the War Within. Now, all outdoor zones, all dungeons, all raids across all of Azeroth are affected. Originally, this was only going to be enemy models. After the research, this included things like enemies, hunter pets, critters in the world, player mounts, which was a very cool one. Our designer found a crab mount that we were able to replace, and dragonfly mounts that we could replace with for some of the spiders and flyers, and vehicles that players get on in the world. And we were sort of debating here, right? Spiders are, probably going to be included, but does that include crypt fiends? Does that include Nerubians? And after this research, we were pretty confident that all of these models should be included except for the new Nerubian race. And that's the one with the four legs and the kind of human torso. And that was based on some of the results that we saw from our survey, saying that those models were a bit more comfortable for players to engage with. And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, like, all right, well, how is it being used? What's going on? Right now, about 3% of our WoW players are playing with the Arachnophobia mode enabled, and that's about as many players as play with colorblind mode enabled. And to give a point of reference, if we had a bug in game that was affecting 3% of our player base, it's something that we would absolutely hear about on the forums. It's something that players would be discussing, in Discord servers and things like that. It's something that we would prioritize fixing. And so seeing that we did have a bug that affected 3% of our player base and being able to come with a solution, different bug, being able to come up with a solution for that, I think feels really good. And I think the players have been really excited by it. And we see a lot of that in the way that people have been talking about this on social media and press coverage. So things on Twitter, things on news sites, just covering how cool this is that it exists and how to turn it on and all the different things that it does. And hey, let me show you how you can enable this has been really, really cool to see. And we also got a bit of a shout out on the Wowcast where Tina and Ian were talking about the feature and kind of showing how it works in Naxxramas. So that was also cool to get this in front of our players and have them see kind of before they were able to get in game what this would do for them. So I'm so excited I was able to share this with you. I want to give a quick thanks to the games user research team at Blizzard and also to all of our amazing employees with Arachnophobia who were willing to take a survey all about spiders and what spiders made them uncomfortable to help us figure this out. If you're using the Arachnophobia mode, we'd love to hear from you and hear how that's been. But thank you all for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A on the Discord server.